Imagine a fighter plane so ridiculed by its enemies, they literally laughed at it. Yet this same aircraft would soon become their worst nightmare, striking fear into the hearts of the mighty Luftwaffe. Spring 1943. Somewhere over the gray expanse of the English Channel, a massive fighter aircraft lumbered through the morning mist like a flying bathtub with wings. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately and derisively nicknamed the Jug by its own pilots, had just arrived in the European theater of operations. German pilots, veterans of countless dogfights against Spitfires and earlier American fighters, watched these newcomers with professional curiosity mixed with contempt. Through their gun sights and across radio frequencies, the Luftwaffe laughed. They saw only a bloated, ungainly machine that appeared to have been designed by committee rather than inspiration. How wrong they were. This is the story of transformation, of underestimation turned to terror, of how the aircraft the Germans mocked became the hammer that would help shatter Nazi air superiority over Europe. This is the story of the Thunderbolt's bloody revenge. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never intended to be beautiful. In the late 1930s, Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, faced a formidable challenge. The Army Air Corps wanted a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, survive punishing combat, and dominate the skies at high altitude. These requirements demanded compromises that would make the aircraft look less like a sleek predator and more like a heavyweight boxer. Kartveli's solution was radical. He wrapped the entire design around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt and Whitney R280 double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. To harness this power at high altitude, he added a turbocharger system that required extensive ducting throughout the fuselage. The result was an aircraft that weighed 7 tons when empty, more than twice the weight of a Spitfire. When fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and ordnance, the Thunderbolt tipped the scales at nearly 8 tons. By comparison, the vaunted Messerschmitt Bf 109 weighed barely 3 tons fully loaded. The prototype first flew in May 1941, and even Republic's own test pilots were skeptical. The aircraft felt ponderous on the ground, its massive bulk requiring careful handling during takeoff. But once airborne, something remarkable happened. At altitude, the Thunderbolt came alive. The turbocharger fed the hungry engine, and the aircraft could reach to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. More importantly, it could dive faster than anything in the sky, and its rugged construction meant it could absorb punishment that would tear other fighters apart. Still, as the first operational squadrons formed in late 1942, doubts persisted. The pilots, many of whom had trained on lighter aircraft, struggled with the Thunderbolt's weight and size. Ground crews complained about its complexity, and when word reached the Luftwaffe that the Americans were bringing a 7-ton fighter to Europe, the German pilots prepared their jokes along with their ammunition. The 56th Fighter Group, the first P-47 unit to reach England, arrived in January 1943. Their commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, was a no-nonsense tactician who understood both the aircraft's potential and its limitations. But potential meant nothing if it couldn't be realized in combat, and the initial missions were disheartening. The Thunderbolt's first combat sorties were escort missions for bombers, striking targets in occupied France. German fighters, primarily Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, rose to meet them. The Luftwaffe pilots, expecting easy victories, attacked with confidence. What followed was a harsh education for both sides. The German pilots quickly discovered that the Thunderbolt, despite its bulk, was no easy target. When they positioned themselves for what should have been killing shots, their cannon shells seemed to disappear into the American fighter's airframe with minimal effect. The P-47's internal structure was a maze of robust components, redundant systems, and armor plating. Pilots reported taking dozens of hits and returning home safely. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, would later survive an attack that saw his aircraft absorb more than 200 bullet and cannon strikes. However, the Germans also noticed something else. In a turning fight, the Thunderbolt was sluggish. At low altitude, it was heavy and unresponsive. When German fighters baited American pilots into slow-speed dogfights, the advantage shifted decisively to the lighter Axis aircraft. Through March and April of 1943, the P-47 units struggled. Losses mounted. Confidence wavered. The Luftwaffe continued to laugh, and their laughter seemed justified. American bomber crews, watching their escorts struggle against nimble German fighters, began to doubt whether the Thunderbolt could do the job. In smoke-filled briefing rooms across England, hard questions were asked. Had the Army Air Force made a catastrophic mistake? Was the P-47 simply too heavy, too cumbersome to succeed in aerial combat? Should resources be redirected to other aircraft types? But Colonel Zemke and other squadron commanders recognized something the critics missed. The problem wasn't the aircraft itself. The problem was how it was being flown. Zemke called his squadron leaders together for a critical meeting in late April 1943. The message was simple but revolutionary. They would stop fighting the Germans' fight and start imposing their own terms of engagement. "Gentlemen," Zemke said, "we have been trying to turn and twist with fighters that were designed for exactly that kind of combat. We're playing their game, and we're losing. That ends today." The new doctrine was built around the P-47's genuine advantages: speed, especially in the dive, altitude performance, firepower, and above all, energy management. American pilots would no longer engage in slow-speed turning fights. Instead, they would maintain speed and altitude, use their superior high-altitude performance to position themselves above German formations and attack in slashing dives, using their tremendous speed to strike and escape before the enemy could react. This was boom and zoom tactics refined to perfection. Pilots were taught to think of altitude as a bank account. Every maneuver had a cost in terms of energy, and that energy could be stored as either altitude or speed. The key was never to spend so much energy that you couldn't escape if the situation turned against you. If a German fighter refused to dive away and instead tried to climb and turn, the correct response was not to follow, but to extend away, climb back to altitude, and reset for another attack. Training intensified. Pilots practiced high-speed gunnery, learning to compensate for the extreme closure rates of diving attacks. They practiced formation discipline, understanding that mutual support was essential. Most importantly, they practiced restraint, learning when not to engage, when to refuse combat on unfavorable terms. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to Allied fighters that would accept any challenge, were unprepared for this new approach. When they climbed to engage, the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher. When they tried to escape by diving, the P-47s followed them down at speeds no German fighter could match. And when the Germans tried to hide at low altitude, the Thunderbolts learned to fight there too, using their rugged construction and superior firepower to advantage. By June 1943, the character of air combat over Europe was changing. The Luftwaffe's laughter was fading, replaced by something new: respect and fear. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning .250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. This might seem like a simple statement of fact, but in reality it represented the most concentrated package of aerial firepower ever mounted on a single-engine fighter up to that time. Each gun could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute. Together, the 8 guns could pour out more than 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction that measured 15 feet across at 300 yards. The kinetic energy delivered in a 1-second burst was equivalent to a small artillery barrage. Pilots who experienced it described the sensation as riding a barely controlled explosion. When all 8 guns fired, the aircraft shuddered, the nose wanted to pitch upward from the recoil, and spent cartridge cases streamed away in golden arcs. German pilots on the receiving end had a different perspective. They described seeing a shimmer in the air, like heat haze, followed by their aircraft literally coming apart around them. The 50 caliber round, weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, could penetrate the armor of most German fighters. A single hit could sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or kill the pilot outright. A 1-second burst could deliver more than 100 rounds. American pilots were taught to fire in short bursts, typically 2 to 3 seconds. This conserved ammunition while delivering devastating effects. Gunnery training emphasized deflection shooting, the difficult art of leading a target to compensate for its motion. The Thunderbolt's gun sight, a computing gun sight in later models, helped pilots make these calculations, but success still required skill, practice, and instinct. Combat reports from mid-1943 onward document the P-47's lethality. German aircraft that survived attacks often returned to base so badly damaged they were written off. Pilots reported aircraft breaking apart in midair from the concentrated fire. Others reported German pilots bailing out immediately upon recognizing they were under attack by Thunderbolts, preferring parachutes to the alternative. But the guns were only part of the story. The P-47 could also carry external ordnance, bombs, rockets, drop tanks. As the war progressed and Allied air superiority became established, Thunderbolts increasingly operated in the ground attack role, and here their firepower was even more devastating. A single P-47 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its gun armament. Entire squadrons could deliver destruction equivalent to a medium bomber strike with far greater precision. German ground forces learned to dread the appearance of Thunderbolts overhead. The aircraft's distinctive silhouette, with its bubble canopy providing excellent visibility, meant that once a Thunderbolt pilot spotted a target, there was little chance of escape. Tank columns, truck convoys, railway stations, bridges, all became targets. The Luftwaffe had laughed at the big American fighter. Now the laughter had stopped entirely. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy represented the largest amphibious operation in history, and air superiority was essential to its success. The Luftwaffe, battered but not broken, threw everything it had into trying to contest the invasion. They failed, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was a major reason why. In the months leading up to D-Day, Thunderbolt units had refined their tactics to near perfection. They operated in what pilots called the fighter-bomber role, carrying bombs for ground attack but ready to jettison them and engage enemy fighters at a moment's notice. On June 6th, Thunderbolts flew thousands of sorties, providing cover for the invasion fleet, attacking German positions, and engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft that attempted to reach the beaches. German pilots who survived later reported that the sky seemed filled with American fighters. Everywhere they looked, there were Thunderbolts. The aircraft they had once mocked had become ubiquitous, unavoidable, lethal. One Luftwaffe pilot, writing in his diary, noted that engaging a lone Thunderbolt was dangerous, engaging a formation was suicidal, and the Americans never seemed to fly alone anymore. The weeks following the invasion were even worse for the Germans. As Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead, Thunderbolt units moved to forward airfields in France, reducing their transit time to the front and increasing their time over the battlefield. German commanders reported that movement during daylight had become almost impossible. Any vehicle, any troop concentration, any artillery position that revealed itself was likely to be attacked within minutes by fighter bombers, usually Thunderbolts. The P-47's ruggedness proved its worth again and again. Pilots flew multiple missions per day, often returning with battle damage that would have downed other aircraft. Ground crews worked miracles, patching holes, replacing damaged components, and returning aircraft to service with remarkable speed. The operational tempo was punishing, but the results were undeniable. By August 1944, the German army in France was in full retreat, and the Luftwaffe's daylight operations had virtually ceased. The Thunderbolt, the aircraft that German pilots had dismissed as a flying milk bottle, had helped achieve air supremacy so complete that Allied ground forces operated with virtually no interference from enemy aircraft. Statistics tell part of the story. P-47 units claim more than 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat during the war. But these numbers, impressive as they are, don't capture the psychological impact. German pilots who had once attacked confidently now looked over their shoulders constantly, knowing that Thunderbolts could appear at any moment, diving from the sun at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, guns blazing. The summer of 1944 was bloody indeed, but the blood was overwhelmingly German. As Allied armies swept across France and into Germany, the P-47's role evolved once more. The Luftwaffe, while still dangerous, was increasingly unable to contest the skies. German fighters were grounded by fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the simple fact that taking off usually meant dying. The Thunderbolt's mission shifted primarily to ground attack, and here it found a new calling as a bridge buster. Germany's transportation network was vital to its war effort. Railways, roads, and especially bridges allowed the movement of troops, supplies, and equipment. Destroy enough bridges, and you could trap entire armies. The problem was that bridges were difficult targets. They were heavily defended, structurally robust, and required precision to destroy. The P-47, with its stable gun platform, heavy ordnance load, and ability to survive defensive fire, proved ideal for the mission. Pilots developed specialized tactics. They would approach at high altitude, dive steeply to build speed and throw off defensive fire, then level off briefly to release bombs or fire rockets at point-blank range before pulling up and escaping. The violence of these attacks was extraordinary. 500-pound bombs could collapse bridge spans. Rockets could penetrate and detonate inside structural members. And the concentrated fire of 8 50-caliber guns could shred lighter bridges or destroy the vehicles backed up at crossing points. German engineers became experts at rapid bridge repair, but they were fighting a losing battle. Every repaired bridge became a target again. Every ferry, every pontoon bridge, every ford became a hunting ground for roving Thunderbolts. One particularly famous mission targeted the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the last remaining bridges across the Rhine. While German forces ultimately failed to destroy it before its capture, the constant harassment by Allied aircraft, including Thunderbolts, prevented effective reinforcement of the defenders. Throughout the fall of 1944 and winter of 1945, Thunderbolt units turned Germany's transportation infrastructure into a shambles. Trains were strafed and burned, truck convoys were decimated, barges were sunk. The economic impact was catastrophic, but the psychological impact was perhaps even greater. German soldiers knew that any movement during daylight invited attack. Civilians fled from the sound of aircraft engines. The nation that had once projected power across an entire continent now cowered beneath skies dominated by American fighters. By this point, the Luftwaffe's initial mockery of the Thunderbolt seemed not just wrong, but almost incomprehensibly foolish. The Jug had become an angel of death, and there was nowhere to hide from it. Every aircraft that achieves greatness does so through the skill and courage of its pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no exception. The roster of Thunderbolt aces reads like a roll call of aerial combat legends. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who pioneered the tactics that made the aircraft successful, scored nearly 18 victories. Major Robert Johnson became one of the most celebrated American aces, with 27 kills. Captain Francis Gabreski shot down 28 enemy aircraft flying Thunderbolts. But beyond the ace pilots with their impressive scores, there were thousands of others who flew the Thunderbolt with distinction. These men, whose names are largely forgotten, fought and often died to establish air superiority over Europe. Their collective achievement was more significant than any individual score. Consider the story of Second Lieutenant William Leverett, who on August 1, 1943, attacked a formation of more than 40 German bombers over the Mediterranean. Flying alone after becoming separated from his unit, Leverett dove into the enemy formation and in a single engagement shot down 5 bombers. He later stated that the P-47's firepower made it possible, but it was his courage that made it happen. Or consider Major Glenn Duncan, who developed many of the low-altitude tactics that made the Thunderbolt effective in ground attack. Duncan understood that the aircraft's ruggedness allowed it to operate in the high-threat environment near the ground, where flak was intense but targets were plentiful. His innovations saved countless Allied soldiers by destroying German armor and artillery. Then there was Captain Walker Mahurin, who scored 19 victories in the Thunderbolt before being shot down over France and evading capture with the help of the French resistance. After escaping, he returned to combat and continued flying, eventually adding to his score. These pilots and hundreds like them shared certain characteristics. They were aggressive but not reckless. They were confident in their aircraft's capabilities while respecting its limitations. They were skilled marksmen, excellent tacticians, and above all, they were survivors who learned from every mission. German pilots who faced them spoke with grudging respect. In interrogations and post-war interviews, Luftwaffe veterans consistently noted that American P-47 pilots were well-trained, disciplined, and increasingly experienced as the war progressed. The easy victories of early 1943 became memories. By late 1944, engaging a Thunderbolt formation was considered a dangerous mission even for veteran German pilots. The human element, combined with the aircraft's capabilities, created a synergy that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Thunderbolt made good pilots great and great pilots legendary, and collectively, these men helped win the air war over Europe. One aspect of the Thunderbolt's success that deserves particular attention is its survivability. This was not an accident of design, but a deliberate engineering choice that saved thousands of lives. The cockpit was protected by heavy armor plating, including a thick steel plate behind the pilot's seat and armored glass in the windscreen. The engine, already large and robust, was further protected by armored cowling. Critical systems were either redundant or protected. The result was an aircraft that could absorb truly astonishing amounts of battle damage and still bring its pilot home. Combat reports document aircraft returning with cylinder heads shot away, control surfaces in tatters, and holes large enough to crawl through. One famous photograph shows a P-47 with its entire tail section nearly severed by flak. The true measure of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not found in its speed at sea level or its theoretical rate of climb, areas where lighter European fighters sometimes held a theoretical edge, but in its unparalleled capacity to survive the brutal crucible of aerial warfare, a testament to a distinctly American engineering philosophy that prioritized pilot protection and structural redundancy above all else. This deliberate ruggedness was the result of wrapping the entire design around the massive Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 double Wasp radial engine, a 2,000 horsepower power plant that was not only the most powerful available, but was also a marvel of reliability. Unlike its liquid-cooled counterparts used by the Allies in the Axis, which could be instantly disabled by a single lucky hit to a fragile cooling system, the air-cooled radial engine could sustain damage that would typically be catastrophic. Pilots consistently reported nursing their Thunderbolts home on half their cylinders, the engine running rough but still producing enough power to keep the heavy fighter airborne. This deep-seated reliability was further enhanced by a comprehensive array of redundant and protected systems. The cockpit, for instance, was not an afterthought. It was a fortress, shielded by heavy armor plating, including thick steel directly behind the pilot, and featuring armored glass in the windscreen to deflect shrapnel and smaller caliber rounds. The critical hydraulic and electrical systems were equally robust, with the latter even including backup generators to ensure flight controls and radios remained operational even after significant battle damage. Perhaps the most vital innovation was the fuel system, which utilized self-sealing tanks capable of rapidly closing bullet holes and preventing the fire that so often spelled the end for other fighters. Every single component of the Thunderbolt was designed with the singular goal of ensuring the aircraft would keep flying, keep fighting, and bring its pilot home alive, a commitment that ultimately led to the P-47 achieving one of the lowest loss rates per sortie of any fighter in the European theater. This was not merely a defensive advantage, it had a profound and immediate psychological impact on both sides. American pilots, secure in the knowledge that their 7-ton jug could absorb damage that would tear other fighters apart, were far more willing to press attacks and engage when the tactical situation was favorable. They were empowered by their machine. Conversely, German Luftwaffe pilots found the Thunderbolt infuriating and demoralizing. They described the sheer frustration of pouring vast amounts of precious cannon ammunition into the American fighter, only to watch it simply absorb the punishment and continue fighting, an experience that shattered their combat confidence. The initial mockery the Luftwaffe had directed at the P-47's bulk had, by 1944, transformed into a grim, grudging respect, because the very bulk they had ridiculed was precisely what kept the fighter airborne when other aircraft would have plummeted from the sky in flames. The engineering philosophy allowed American designers to afford to add weight for protection. This structural integrity created legends in the air, iconic moments of near-impossible survival that were captured in combat reports and photographs, detailing aircraft returning with shredded control surfaces, gaping holes large enough for a person to crawl through, and engines missing cylinder heads. This legendary ruggedness allowed the P-47 Thunderbolt to transcend its initial role as a high-altitude escort fighter and become the most versatile combat aircraft of World War II. The transformation began in the spring of 1943 when the early combat losses forced a critical tactical reevaluation by leaders like Colonel Hubert Zemke. The problem was not the aircraft itself, but how it was being flown. The P-47 was a heavy fighter, sluggish in low altitude, slow-speed turning fights where German fighters like the Messerschmitt B, F-109, and Focke-Wulf 190 excelled. The German pilots, veterans of years of dogfighting, exploited this limitation, and their laughter seemed justified as losses mounted among American units. Zemke's revolutionary solution was simple: stop playing the enemy's game. He pioneered the boom and zoom tactic, an aggressive and powerful strategy built entirely around the Thunderbolt's inherent strengths: speed, altitude performance, and firepower. Pilots were instructed to maintain speed and altitude, thinking of altitude as a bank account of potential energy. They would position themselves high above German formations and attack in slashing dives, using their tremendous speed to strike with their devastating arsenal, and then escape before the enemy could react. This new doctrine, centered on energy management, meant that if a German fighter tried to climb and turn, the P-47 pilot would simply extend away, climb back to altitude, and reset for another attack. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to Allied fighters that would accept any challenge, was utterly unprepared for this disciplined, high-speed approach. When they tried to engage, the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher, and when they attempted to escape by diving, the P-47s followed them down at speeds no German fighter could match. By June 1943, the character of air combat had irrevocably changed. The Luftwaffe's laughter was replaced by respect, and more tellingly, fear. The primary weapon facilitating this terror was the P-47's unprecedented armament. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. This represented the most concentrated package of aerial firepower ever mounted on a single-engine fighter up to that time. Firing over 6,000 rounds per minute, the 8 guns created a cone of destruction 15 feet across at 300 yards, delivering a kinetic energy equivalent to a small artillery barrage. German pilots described seeing a shimmer in the air, like heat haze, followed by their aircraft literally coming apart around them. A single 1-second burst could deliver over 100 rounds of armor-penetrating ammunition. The lethality was such that German pilots were frequently reported bailing out immediately upon recognizing they were under attack by Thunderbolts, preferring parachutes to the alternative. As the war progressed and Allied air superiority became established, the Thunderbolt's mission expanded into the fighter-bomber role, where its rugged airframe and high payload capacity found a new calling. A single P-47 could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its guns, delivering destruction equivalent to a medium bomber strike with far greater precision. German ground forces came to dread the appearance of the distinctive bubble canopy overhead, knowing that once a Thunderbolt pilot spotted a target, be it a tank column, truck convoy, or railway station, there was little chance of escape. In the months leading up to D-Day and in the frantic pursuit across France, the P-47 turned German daylight movement into an impossibility, cementing its reputation as the ultimate ground attack hammer. The names of Thunderbolt aces like Colonel Hubert Zemke, 18 victories, Major Robert Johnson, 27 kills, and Captain Francis Gabreski, 28 enemy aircraft, became legends. But their individual scores were only part of the story. Their collective achievement, built on the aircraft's raw power and survivability, was establishing and maintaining the air superiority that won the war for the Allies. Their shared tenacity, combined with the P-47's ability to absorb punishment, as famously demonstrated by the aircraft with its entire tail section. Held on by only a few structural members, yet it still flew and landed successfully. Robert Johnson's survival after his encounter with German fighters became legendary. His aircraft was hit repeatedly by cannon fire. The canopy was shattered. The control stick was shot out of his hand. Fuel was streaming from ruptured tanks. The engine was running rough. But the Thunderbolt kept flying, and Johnson nursed it across the English Channel to a crash landing in England. He walked away. This survivability had a profound psychological effect on both sides. American pilots gained confidence knowing their aircraft could protect them. They were more willing to press attacks, more willing to engage when the tactical situation was favorable. German pilots, conversely, found it frustrating and demoralizing to pour ammunition into an enemy aircraft and watch it simply absorb the punishment and continue fighting. The engineering philosophy behind this ruggedness was distinctly American. Where European designers often prioritized performance and accepted more fragility, American designers had the luxury of powerful engines and could afford to add weight for protection. The R2800 engine was itself a marvel of reliability. Unlike some liquid-cooled engines that could be disabled by a single puncture to the cooling system, the radial engine could lose entire cylinders and continue running. Pilots reported making it home on half their cylinders, the engine running rough but still producing enough power to fly. This reliability extended to the aircraft's systems. The hydraulics were robust. The electrical system had backup generators. The fuel system had self-sealing tanks that could seal bullet holes and prevent fires. Everything about the Thunderbolt was designed to keep flying, keep fighting, and bring its pilot home alive. By war's end, the P-47 had one of the lowest loss rates per sortie of any fighter aircraft in the European theater. This was not because it avoided danger, but because it could survive danger better than its opponents. The Luftwaffe had laughed at its bulk. That bulk was what kept it flying when other aircraft would have fallen from the sky in flames. While the P-47 Thunderbolt's primary theater of operations was Western Europe, its influence extended far beyond. Through Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union received hundreds of P-47s, and Soviet pilots had their own experiences with the formidable fighter. Soviet assessments of the Thunderbolt were mixed but generally favorable. Pilots appreciated its firepower and survivability. However, they noted that it required different tactics than the Yak and Lavochkin fighters they were accustomed to flying. The P-47 was not well suited to the low-altitude, dogfighting style that dominated the Eastern Front. Nevertheless, specialized units used Thunderbolts effectively, particularly in ground attack roles. The aircraft's ability to carry heavy ordnance loads and survive intense flak made it valuable for attacking German armor and fortifications. Soviet maintenance crews, however, struggled initially with the aircraft's complexity compared to simpler Soviet designs. The German Luftwaffe units operating on the Eastern Front received warnings about the Thunderbolt from their comrades in the West. These warnings were initially dismissed. Eastern Front pilots, veterans of brutal combat against Soviet aircraft, believed they could handle anything the Allies fielded. Then the first Thunderbolts appeared, and the lessons learned in the West had to be learned again in the East. German pilots discovered that the same tactics that worked against Soviet fighters were less effective against the heavier, faster American aircraft. These experiences reinforced what was already known in the West. The Thunderbolt demanded respect regardless of where it operated. Whether over France, Germany, or the Eastern Front, the aircraft's combination of speed, firepower, and survivability made it a dominant force. The psychological impact spread through the Luftwaffe like a contagion. Pilots who transferred from the Eastern to Western fronts, or vice versa, carried with them stories and warnings about the American fighter. The laughter that had greeted its arrival in 1943 was now a distant memory, replaced by a healthy fear. Though less numerous in the Pacific theater, P-47s also served with distinction against Japan. The challenges here were different from Europe. Distances were vast, requiring exceptional range. Japanese fighters like the Zero were extraordinarily maneuverable at low speeds. The Thunderbolt's weight, a liability in European dogfights, was less problematic in the Pacific, where engagements often occurred at higher speeds and altitudes. American pilots quickly learned that trying to turn with a Zero was suicidal, but using boom and zoom tactics, the P-47 could dominate. While Japanese anti-aircraft fire was generally less intense than German flak, Japanese fighters often attacked with suicidal determination. The Thunderbolt's armor and structural strength allowed it to survive attacks that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. One notable advantage in the Pacific was the P-47's long range when equipped with drop tanks. As American forces island hopped toward Japan, Thunderbolts could escort bombers to targets that had previously been beyond fighter range. This extended protection saved countless bomber crews and increased the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. Japanese pilots, like their German counterparts, initially underestimated the Thunderbolt. Japanese intelligence reports described it as a heavy, ungainly fighter that would be easy prey for experienced Zero pilots. The reality proved very different. American pilots, trained in energy fighting tactics, used their speed and firepower to devastating effect. One Japanese pilot captured after the war described encountering a formation of Thunderbolts over the Philippines. His unit attacked confidently, expecting to outmaneuver the heavy American fighters. Instead, the Thunderbolts maintained their formation, accelerated away from the attacking Zeros, climbed to altitude, and then dove back through the Japanese formation, destroying 3 aircraft in a single pass before extending away again. The Zero pilots, unable to catch the faster aircraft, could only watch helplessly as the Thunderbolts repositioned for another attack. By late 1944, P-47s were also being used extensively in the ground attack role in the Pacific. They strafed Japanese airfields, destroyed shipping, and supported ground operations. The aircraft's 8 machine guns were devastatingly effective against light Japanese structures and unarmored vehicles. In the final months of the war, Thunderbolts participated in attacks on the Japanese home islands, striking industrial targets and infrastructure. Though the Pacific campaign is often associated with other aircraft types, the Thunderbolt's contribution was significant, and like in Europe, the initial mockery and underestimation gave way to respect earned through blood and fire. The war ended in August 1945. The P-47 Thunderbolt had served with distinction across multiple theaters, compiled an impressive combat record, and helped establish Allied air superiority. More than 15,000 were built, making it one of the most produced fighters of the war. In the immediate post-war period, the Thunderbolt was rapidly phased out of American service, replaced by jet aircraft. But its influence extended far beyond its years of active service. Many countries continued operating P-47s through the 1950s and even into the 1960s. The lessons learned from its design and operation influenced subsequent generations of fighter aircraft. The emphasis on survivability, firepower, and pilot protection became standard. The tactical doctrines developed by Thunderbolt pilots became foundational to modern air combat theory. Energy management, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, using formation discipline. These principles are still taught today. Perhaps most importantly, the Thunderbolt story demonstrates the danger of first impressions and the importance of proper employment. The Luftwaffe laughed at the big, heavy American fighter, and that laughter proved catastrophic. They judged based on appearance rather than capability, and they paid a terrible price for their assumption. Modern military analysts study the Thunderbolt as a case study in how technical characteristics must be matched with appropriate tactics. An aircraft is not simply good or bad in absolute terms. Its effectiveness depends on how it is used, the doctrine surrounding its employment, and the training of its pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt, designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, evolved into one of the most versatile combat aircraft of World War II. It excelled in roles its designers never envisioned. It survived damage that should have destroyed it. It carried pilots home when all logic said they should die. And it exacted revenge, bloody and complete, on those who had mocked it. Today, a few flying examples remain, treasured by museums and collectors. When a P-47 takes to the air, the thunder of its massive radial engine still turns heads. Those who hear it and understand its history are reminded that appearances can be deceiving, that mockery can be premature, and that underestimating one's opponent is always a potentially fatal mistake. The Luftwaffe laughed. The Thunderbolt answered, and that answer echoed through the skies over Europe in the thunder of 850 caliber guns, the scream of diving attacks, and the sight of enemy aircraft falling in flames. This was not just revenge. It was vindication, justice, and the demonstration that wars are won not by those who laugh first, but by those who fight smart, adapt quickly, and never ever give up. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, the jug, the flying milk bottle, The aircraft that German pilots mocked became one of the great fighters of history. Its story is one of transformation, determination, and ultimate triumph. And perhaps that is the greatest revenge of all.